Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to our class in oral communication. So, today we're going to talk about the different models of communication. So, when we're talking about the different models of communication, of course, we need to identify the differences between one way and two-way communication. So when we say one-way communication, it also has a receiver and also a sender. However, here in the receiver's part, they are not required to give or to send a certain feedback or a certain reaction. However, when we're talking about the two-way communication, the sender here and also the receiver are active and important in the communication process. And here, the feedback from the receiver is very important because there is a simultaneous exchanging of ideas between the participants. Now we're going to identify the three major elements or three major models of communication. And first one, we need to identify and explain what do we mean by the word model. So according to the QS study, a model can be defined as a visual presentation that identifies, classifies, describes various parts of a certain process. So of course, in a model of communication, we have here a different elements or different components of communication that we've already discussed. So here, according to them as well, according to the QS study, they identified that the communication model is a communication process which represented by either a line or a picture. And in other words, this is what we call as the pictorial presentation of the communication model. As we all know, communication is not an easy process. It's a complicated one. And determining whether with whom a message begins and ends, it's also a challenging process. That is why communication model is one of a task or a visual presentation which could also help us individual in order for us to go into a deeper detail of a different elements present in a different communication situation. There are communication models go into greater detail. However, for the others, they have just included limited capacity or limited elements of the communication. Now we're going to describe, okay, another definition of communication model by Kobiruzoman 2021. According to him, he referred the communication model as the conceptual framework or theories that explains how human communicate. And now let's go to the three major models of communication, which is the first one, the linear model of communication. When we say linear model of communication, it is a one-way interaction where feedback is not present. Okay. Here, the receiver is not required to give his or her feedback during the communication process. However, when we're talking about the transactional model, it's a two-way process of communication. It means there is a simultaneous communication, okay? And there will be a feedback here, an immediate feedback. However, when we're talking about the interactional or interactive model of communication, it is almost the same with the transactional. However, here you can't get an immediate feedback. So there will be no simultaneous feedback here. The feedback is, of course, is indirect and you cannot get it immediately. So that is why that's one of their main differences. So now let's go through to the different models of linear model of communication, which of course when we say linear, it involves more on a persuasion. Okay, so the first model under it is what we call the Aristotle's model of communication. So Aristotle's model of communication was known as the earliest and first model of communication, and Aristotle was a teacher of rhetoric and a founder of an academy that produced good speakers. So that is why the main purpose of Aristotle's model of communication is to analyze a communication in a public speaking. Okay, so it is more focused on that thing instead of interpersonal communication. So here in Aristotle's model of communication, the speaker plays a very important role in public speaking, and that is to influence or persuade his or her audience. He or she must prepare his or her speech and analyze the audience before he speaks to them. So right now, we're going to identify the different elements of Aristotle's model of communication. And the first one is what we call the speaker. The second is the speech. The third one is the occasion. The fourth is the audience. And the fifth one is the effect. So let's try to give real life example for this one. So for the Aristotle's model of communication, for example, there will be a certain politician that's trying to give his or her talk in front of a crowd. And that political leader will be a speaker or a sender of the message. He or she will deliver a speech in front of the crowd. And he or she will be the most important person there. It's because he or she will provide the message or information to the crowd. However, when we're talking about the speech, these are the message that the political leader trying to deliver to influence his or her audience. And of course, when we're talking about the occasion or situation, it talks about, for example, the election or election campaign. And the occasion and also the way the speaker communicates and deliver his message is also being affected by his or her targeted recipient or audience or situation or occasion. And of course, for the audience, it refers to what we call as the receiver. And for the effect, we're not talking a literal feedback here, but rather the effect of a certain message to your receiver. And that example, one of the effect of this one is the level of motivation of the voters, whether they are motivated to cast a vote for him or not. And in Aristotle's model of communication, this is more on a speaker-centered model of communication, as the speaker has the most important role here, and he is the only one active. So it's the speaker's role to make a speech, okay, clear to everyone. However, the role of the listener or the receiver here is just passive, and they are not active, and they are being influenced only by the speech of the sender. That is why this makes the communication process a one-way communication. And of course, Aristotle also believed with the rhetoric. When we say rhetoric, it is the study of communication and persuasion, and a different message or speech should be made for different audiences at different situations to get the desired effect at that time and for them to establish a propaganda during that time. So Aristotle also added the three elements for you to become good communicator. And the first one is what we call the ethos. So when we say ethos, it is your characteristic as a person or as a speaker, which makes you credible in front of your audience. For example, you are speaking in front of a medical professionals. Of course, you should, before you could give your speech, you should have a background knowledge. You should have expertise on the medical jargons and, of course, on the sciences. It's because if there is no credibility, your audience will not be able to believe in you and will not be persuaded by your speech. So that is why it's important for you to have an expertise on that kind of subject matter or in that kind of field before you could give a talk, so that you could give more examples, you could be able to give quality information. And of course, for the pathos, if what matters, okay, to them and they can connect with them, of course, they will be interested. Here, we are talking more on about the relevance of your topic to your listener or to your targeted audience. So, for example, here, okay, let's take an example here of the political leader earlier. For example, he or she will give her talk, and one of his or her platforms is building roads, building a different thing. Okay. However, the needs and the wants of a community there, okay, is of course a water system, because they lack of it. They lack in water, they lack for an irrigation. And same goes with whenever you are speaking, whenever you are giving your topic, whenever you are giving an example, whenever you are providing some information, it should something related to your audience. It should be something that they need, that they want, just like in the example earlier, so that they will be more influenced by whatever you are going to say. Emotional bonds will make the audience captivated, and they will feel that the speaker is there people as well. Okay, next one is the logos. So when we're talking about the logos here, we're trying to talk more and about you as a speaker presenting factual information and not only your personal opinion or personal experiences. You must be able to give accurate answer, accurate examples as well. Okay, and there is also one of the criticisms received by Aristotle in this model. And one of that is, according to some critics or according to some experts, he did not provide any concept of feedback, any concept of noise, and he just only used this one for public speaking. And for the second model of linear model of communication, which is the Laswell's model of communication, which was created by Harold D. Laswell in 1948 in order for him to analyze and demonstrate the culture of mass media. Okay, unlike in the Aristotle's model earlier, it's more focused on public speaking. Here in the Laswell's model, it's more focused on mass media or mass communication, and it is regarded as the most influential communication models. So just like with Aristotle, Laswell's model also has different components and different elements, which the first one is the who, which talks about the sender. Next one is the says what, which talks about the message. The third one is the channel or the medium, and of course the receiver or to whom, and the feedback or with what effect. Again, we're not literally talking about the literal feedback here. We're just talking an effect of a certain message to your targeted audience. It's because again, this is still under the linear model of communication. So here we're going to give an example, okay, which also something related to the different elements of Laswell. And according to the operator of Tokyo Electric Power Corporation or TPC, okay, they've mentioned this one that there was a radioactive material present in the sea that was being aired in the CNN news. Now we're going to identify that the sender of the information here. So who sent the information? The TEPC operator or Tokyo Electric Power Corporation. The next one is, of course, the topic being discussed is the radioactive material and the channel that they've used in order for them to send the information to the public, which is the television, and of course, with who are their targeted audience, it's the public. And for the effect, of course, if citizens or people in the community will know about this, they will, be alert on this one. And of course, aside from this one, in the Laswell's model of communication, this model by Laswell was also created, aside from, in order for him to analyze the mass communication, it's also being created to investigate the propaganda campaigns of different countries and different corporations at the time. It's because only wealthy people could afford communication devices, televisions, and radios during that time. And just like with the other models of communication, it also received criticisms. And one of it was that he ignored the possibility of noise. And he also ignored or does not include any form of feedback. So right now, we're going to talk about another model of linear model, which is the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. In the Shannon-Weaver model, it was created by Claude Elwood Shannon and Warren Weaver. So Claude Elwood Shannon was an American mathematician, whereas Warren Weaver was a scientist. So their mathematical theory of communication, later known as what we call the Shannon Weaver model of communication. And you must take down note that the Shannon-Weaver model of communication is called as the mother of all models. It is called as the mother of all models because this model is more technological than the first two model of communication that we've mentioned earlier. So the purpose why Shannon and Weaver created this model, it's for them to identify and analyze the communication situation in the telephone communication. This model of communication is also known as a telephone model, for this is based on the experience of using telephone back in the 1940s, wherein the message was hindered by noise. Therefore, the message received by the receiver or by the listener was not necessarily the message sent by the sender. And since we are talking about telephone model or telephone communication, they've also introduced the concept of noise, which were absent in the first two linear models of the communication. So they've introduced the concept of noise here. So just like with the other models of communication, it also has elements of communication. The first one is the information source, which talks about the sender, and the transmitter, which talks about the encoder, and then of course the receiver or the recipient, and the destination or where the message must reach. And of course, the presence of noise or disturbances. It could be an environment, it could be people, and many more. And just like with the previous models of communication, it also receives some criticisms. And one of it is that this model of communication does not include or does not represent any form of feedback. That is why it's still under the linear model of communication. However, as Shannon was an engineer, this model was first made in order to improve the telephonic or the technical communication. So mainly for telephonic communication, it was made to maximize telephone capacity with minimum noise. And later, Warren Weaver applied this one for all of the kinds of communication to develop an effective and purposeful communication, and now the model became known as the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, came from their names. Next, for the fourth one, this is what we call the Berlus SMCR. So Berlus SMCR has four major elements, which is the S, M, C, and R, which stands for the source, message, channel, and also receiver. And it was created by David Berlo in 1960. Actually, this model of communication was based on the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, the one that we've discussed earlier. And this model of communication describes factors affecting individual components. Those are the source, message, channel, and then the receiver in making the communication effective. And also here in the Shannon-Weaver, in Berlus SMCR rather, since it was based on the Shannon-Weaver model, it's also has different elements of it. The first one is, of course, the source, message, channel, and of course, the receiver. So here, one of the main purpose why he created the Berlus SMCR is, of course, for the encoding and decoding of message. So as you can see here, the source and also the receiver have the same subcomponents, which the first one is the communication skills, attitude, knowledge, social system, and culture. For the communication skills, which talks about that if one of the receiver or if the receiver, either the receiver or the sender, okay, does not have good communication skills, of course, their message will fail. Okay. And if the communication skills of both the sender and also the receiver are good, of course, their message will be communicated better. And the next one is the attitude. So the attitude of the sender and also the receiver creates effect of the message. The person's attitude toward self, toward other people, toward environment, toward the receiver can also changes the meaning of the message. And of course, the knowledge. Familiarity of a certain topic, familiarity of the subject matter you are talking about is also one of an essential factor in order for you to be able to transmit the message properly. okay, to your targeted audience, and of course the social systems. So the way we communicate with our receiver or to our targeted audience, it's being influenced or affected by our own values, by our beliefs, by the laws and rules of the land, our religion, and other social factors. And of course, the culture could also make a difference for us in sending an information. Culture make differences when message, for example, the way you communicate, the way you use the language is offensive for some other culture, and for the other culture, for another culture is just accepted. So now we're talking about, let's move to the second element, which is the message. So the message is, of course, being affected in this one. So we have different subcomponents of it, which is the content, the elements, treatment, structure, and also the code. So here, when we say content, of course, it's the topic. Okay, the whole message from the beginning up to the end, and of course the elements. We're talking about here the nonverbal things such as gestures, signs, and many more. For the treatment, it is the way in which the message is conveyed to the receiver. Treatment also affects the feedback of the receiver. And of course, the next one is the structure. So the structure, this is how are you going to organize or arrange your thoughts before you sending it. And of course, the code, which could be in the form of language, text, or video. This is the form in which the message is being sent. And the channel. So when we're talking about the channel, it is being affected by the different senses, such as the sense of hearing, sense of sight, sense of touch, sense of smelling, and sense of taste, and okay, and a different one of this. So it was being affected by this one. So here we're not literally talking about that you need to present or you need to look for a food in order for the other people to smell it or taste it. But here you are just going to use words or descriptive words in order for you to let your receiver or to let your listeners be able to visualize the things that you want them to smell, that you want them to taste, and in many aspects. Now, okay, since we're already done with the receiver, same goes with the source earlier since they have the same subcomponents. One of the criticisms of Berlus SMCR is that there is no concept of feedback here. That is why it is still considered the linear model. There is also no concept of noise here, according to some critics and some experts. Now, let's go through the second major model of communication, which is the transactional model of communication. Now, let's be more focused on the different models under it. So here, it's also being affected by the different factors, which we're going to talk about in our different sessions. So one of the main model in the transactional model of communication is the Barlands model of communication, which was proposed by Dean Barland in 1970. So he proposed this in order for him to identify basic interpersonal communication. Okay, that's one of the main purpose of this. You can just take down notes of this. When we say basic interpersonal communication, it helps in which we articulate, okay, that sending and also receiving of the message happens simultaneously between people. And here in the Barlands model of communication, it has been further adapted and further reformed by the other language theories, and they've known this one as a general transactional model of communication. And as you can see, okay, in the Dean Barlands model of communication, okay, in 1970, they've also have what we call the multi-layered feedback system. He presented this one. When we say multi-layered feedback system, since this is under transactional model of communication, there is a continuous process where sender and receiver interchanges their places or their roles. Unlike in the linear model of communication earlier, the most important person there is only what we call the sender. Here, both the sender and also the receiver are equally important. The message passing takes place with a constant feedback here. However, upon seeing here or upon checking with the model of the Barlands model of communication, you can see that their model is a very complex model. Okay, so that is one of the major criticisms or the major critics of the language experts or the language researchers during his time. And it's because both the sender and also the receiver must understand, okay, the codes sent by each other. And right now we're going to talk about another model in transactional model of communication, which is the helical model of communication, which was proposed by Frank Dance in 1967. And it is called as the helical model of communication. So the helical model of communication introduces the concept of time. You can just take down note of this. The concept of time where continuousness of the communication process and relational interactions are very important. Communication is taken as a dynamic process in a helical model of communication, and it progresses as we age. As we've experienced a lot of things and our vocabulary also increases. So just like you could just try to, okay, give an example. Whenever you were a child, you have a limited capacity and you have a limited knowledge when it comes to the language that you are using. But as time goes by, as you grow, whenever you've experienced to talk with other people, your vocabulary also increases and your knowledge about the language that you use also improves and increases. So same goes with the helical model of communication. As you can see here in the diagram, let's take a look at the PowerPoint presentation. At first, the helical spring is just small at the bottom and it grows bigger and bigger as the communication progresses. So same effect with how humans communicate with other. Your knowledge grows steadily as you know the topic better, as you know how are you going to communicate properly using the language that you use. So the helical model or the helix is compared with the evolution of the communication of a human since birth to the existing time. And the helical model of communication can also give you geometrical testimony of communication. So here in the helical model of communication, it also receives some criticisms. And one of it, it's more simple according to some critics. And to some critics, they've not considered this one as a model. It's because it has only few variables, unlike in the Dean Barlan models of communication, which is it's a more complex one. Now we're going to go through to the interactional or interactive model of communication, which in this model, one of the main models here is the Wilbur Scrum's model of communication. It is also being affected by the different elements such as the encoder source or the sender, the decoder or the receiver, the message itself, the feedback, and the field of experience. So the field of experience in this one is one of the important element here in the Wilbur Scrum model of communication. This is everything that makes a person unique. It's everything that they have learned, studied, watched, heard, and many more. And in this model of communication, it has also 6 elements: source, encoder, message, channel, decoder, receiver. And he gives more emphasis on encoding and decoding of the message here in the Wilbur Scrum model of communication and the field of experience. So Wilbur Scrum created this model of communication and he is known as the father of mass communication. He asserts that the sender and also the receiver should have a same field of experience. And he also developed this model of communication in order for him to explain the communication breakdown. Please take down notes of this. He explained the communication breakdown and he gives emphasis on the encoding and decoding of the message. And according to Wilbur Scrum model of communication, there should be an overlap between the field of experience between the speaker and also the receiver during the communication process. And as you can see here in the diagram, you could see that there will be an encoder in the first circle. It's on your left side. Encoder, interpreter, decoder. And on your right side, you could see the decoder, interpreter, encoder. So as you can see, they have almost the same elements. However, they are not the same when it comes to their places. It's because in the first dialogue, okay, you will be the speaker and the other one will be the receiver. In the second dialogue, you will now be the speaker and the other one will be the receiver, and goes like that. It's because there is a two-way communication. However, you can get immediate feedback here. So when we say field of experience and overlapping of field of experience class, okay, of the one we've added, the one Wilbur Scrum already added in his model, it's for example, a certain person or a certain group of people try to give you or try to talk to you in their language that you are not used to. So of course, whenever they are talking, okay, you can't be able to relate with them. You can't be able to understand them. It's because they are not using the language that you used to. And same goes with you. They can't be able to understand you as well. So that's one of the main reasons why field of experience is also important. Field of experience when it comes to language use and knowledge when it comes to subject matter is also important. Just like with the other models, this also has received some criticism such as, okay, it did not include some semantic noise. However, one of the central feature here is the feedback, according to some critics. So those are the different communication model or model of communication: the linear, transactional, interactive, or interactional model of communication.